The ticking of your clock began in a silent monastery. Medieval monks were not just men of prayer but architects of the modern world. By the end of this story, you will see the so-called Dark Ages in an entirely new light. How did communities devoted to isolation become Europe's greatest inventors? What secret knowledge was cultivated behind those stone walls? The legacy of these quiet revolutionaries is hidden in plain sight, woven into the fabric of our daily lives. What does true innovation look like when it serves a higher purpose? Before the sun even touched the horizon, a bell would ring out in the deep quiet of Cluny. This was the first call to prayer, marking the start of a day governed by a sacred rhythm, ora et labora, prayer and work. To an outsider, this rigid schedule might have looked like a life of simple repetition, a world closed off from progress. But within that very structure lay a secret. The monastic day was not a cage, it was a blueprint for building the future. The man behind this revolutionary design was Benedict of Nursia. His rule for monasteries was far more than a spiritual text. It was a masterful organizational manual for a self-sufficient community. Benedict wrote that the monastery should be laid out so that all necessities are available within its walls, so the monks do not need to wander outside. This single idea, this drive for self-containment, forced them to become masters of every practical art. They had to solve problems of water supply, food production, building maintenance, and health, all with their own hands and minds. The rule demanded discipline, order, and meticulous record-keeping, transforming the monastery into a living laboratory. Every task, from brewing beer to copying manuscripts, was approached with the same systematic care. This was not a life of mindless toil, but one of intentional, cumulative improvement. The stability of the monastic routine, where generations of monks lived and worked under the same roof, created the rarest of commodities in the medieval world, a timeline long enough for true innovation to take root and grow. The bell's call in the night was absolute, but the human response was often a struggle. A monk, jolted from a deep sleep, would fumble in the dark, his own body betraying the demands of the divine schedule. This very human problem, the simple need to wake on time for the night office, sparked a revolution that would eventually regiment the entire world. The relentless monastic rhythm, the 7 sacred hours of prayer each day and night, demanded a precision that sundials and water clocks could not provide. So, behind those stone walls, minds began to work on a solution. They experimented with complex water clocks that used floats and gears to sound bells. They tried calibrated candles that would burn down and release a weight at a set time, but the true breakthrough came with the weight-driven mechanical clock. This was a machine of gears and escapements, a device that did not rely on the flow of water or the burning of wax, but on the steady, unfailing force of gravity. Historians of technology note that the first great weight-driven clocks were not built for town squares, but for monastery towers, their loud bells ensuring the entire community adhered to the sacred timetable. This innovation did far more than schedule prayers. It introduced a radical new idea to European society, the concept of measurable, equal hours. Time was no longer just the position of the sun or the length of a shadow. It became an abstract, quantifiable resource. This new perception of time would fundamentally reshape all of human activity. It altered how work was organized, laying the groundwork for shifts and wages. It brought new precision to commerce and navigation. It gave scientists a constant unit for measuring change and motion. The monastery's clock became the heartbeat of a new, more precise way of living, a relentless rhythm that we still follow today, its legacy ticking silently within every digital schedule and smartphone alarm. The same discipline that regimented time was also turning swamps into wheat fields. While the mechanical clock brought order to the hours, the monks were undertaking an even more profound transformation of the landscape itself. Far from the main abbey, on the edges of untamed wilderness, lay the monastic granges. These were not just farms, they were vast, open-air laboratories for agricultural science. The Cistercian order, in particular, had a reputation for seeking out the most difficult, unproductive land, seeing in the marshes and dense forests not an obstacle, but a divine challenge. Their records state their purpose clearly: to cultivate the earth and transform the wilderness into a garden, and they did this with a systematic approach that Europe had not seen since the fall of Rome. They organized their lands into large, centrally managed estates, which allowed them to experiment on a scale impossible for the small, scattered plots of a peasant farmer. One of their most powerful innovations was a sophisticated system of crop rotation. Instead of exhausting a field by planting the same crop year after year, they would cycle between grains like wheat and barley one year, followed by legumes like peas and beans the next, and then let the field lie fallow to recover. This was not guesswork, it was a carefully observed process. They discovered that the legumes actually enriched the soil with nitrogen, making it more fertile for the next grain crop. This simple but brilliant cycle dramatically increased overall food production and ensured the long-term health of the land. To work the heavy, wet soils of Northern Europe, they championed a new piece of technology: the heavy-wheeled plow. This massive tool, often pulled by a team of oxen, could cut deep into the dense, clay-rich earth that lighter plows simply skimmed over. It turned the soil thoroughly, creating drainage furrows that allowed previously waterlogged fields to become productive. This single tool unlocked the agricultural potential of entire regions. The monks were meticulous record keepers, documenting yields, weather patterns, and the results of their experiments. They applied this same systematic thinking to viticulture, carefully selecting and cultivating grape varieties that thrived in their local climates, laying the foundations for famous wine regions that still exist today. Their herds of sheep and cattle were bred for specific traits, improving the quality of wool and meat. This agricultural revolution did more than just fill the monastery's own storerooms. The surplus they generated became a cornerstone of the medieval economy, sold at local markets or used to support the poor in times of hardship. The techniques they perfected on their experimental farms slowly filtered out to the surrounding peasantry, boosting food security for entire communities. The monastery's walls, designed for separation, could not contain the bounty they had created, proving that their most enduring legacy was not just in the books they copied, but in the very soil they transformed. Stepping into the nave of a great Gothic cathedral is an experience that still steals the breath away. Your eyes are drawn upward, following lines of stone that seem to defy their own weight, soaring toward a canopy of jeweled light. This architectural wonder, this vision of heaven brought to earth, was not born in a king's court but from the spiritual and engineering ambitions of the monastic world. The desire to create a sacred space flooded with divine light drove a series of radical engineering breakthroughs. The rounded, heavy Romanesque arch was limiting. It required massive, thick walls to support its outward thrust, leaving little room for windows and creating dark, cavernous interiors. Monastic builders began experimenting with a new shape, the pointed arch. This simple change in geometry was revolutionary. A pointed arch directs more of its weight downward rather than pushing outward with such force. This allowed for taller, more slender structures. But the arch was only the beginning. To create a stone ceiling for these vast spaces, they developed the rib vault. Imagine the stone ceiling not as a solid, heavy shell, but as a skeleton. The rib vault is precisely that, a web of arched stone ribs that form a supporting framework. The spaces between the ribs could then be filled with thinner, lighter stone, drastically reducing the overall weight the walls had to bear. The final and most dramatic innovation was the flying buttress. This was the masterstroke that truly unlocked the Gothic sky. These elegant, arched stone braces leap from the top of the tall walls to external piers, acting like powerful shoulders that push back against the inward and outward thrust of the vaults and arches. By transferring the structural forces to the outside, the flying buttress made the wall itself almost redundant as a support. It was no longer a load-bearing cliff, but a delicate screen that could be punctured with vast, luminous windows. The birthplace of this integrated system is widely attributed to the Abbey Church of Saint Denis near Paris in the 12th century. Under the guidance of its abbot, Suger, the church was rebuilt with a clear intention to use material beauty to elevate the soul toward the immaterial divine. He wrote of the wonder of the uninterrupted light pouring through the most sacred windows. This was not mere construction. It was applied physics and mathematics in the service of a spiritual vision. The monks and their masons had essentially discovered the principles of the modern skeleton frame, creating a stone and glass vessel for light that would define an era and demonstrate a breathtaking mastery over material and space, leaving a legacy that still inspires centuries later. That same mastery over stone and soil extended to the very rivers that flowed through their lands. Water was far more than a source of life for the monastery. It was a tireless, obedient servant. A complex network of canals, aqueducts, and sluice gates transformed a simple stream into a versatile source of power, channeling its energy to drive a symphony of automated industry. The key to this power was the water mill, a technology the monks did not invent, but one they perfected and applied on a scale the ancient world had never imagined. They saw in the turning of a water wheel an opportunity to replace the back-breaking toil of human and animal labor with the relentless, efficient force of hydraulics. At the heart of this system was the mill for grinding grain. This alone was a revolutionary labor-saving device, freeing countless hours for other work. But monastic engineers did not stop there. They developed sophisticated systems of gears and axles to transfer the water wheel's rotation to other machines. They powered fulling mills where heavy wooden hammers pounded woven wool in water and clay to thicken and cleanse it, a process essential for producing quality cloth. They drove trip hammers for forging metal, the rhythmic, mechanical blows shaping iron for tools and construction. They even automated the arduous process of tanning leather, using water power to operate bellows for maintaining high temperatures in vats and to drive stamping mills that crushed oak bark for tannin. The scale of these installations could be breathtaking. Consider the Cistercian Abbey of Royaumont in France, established in the 13th century. Historical and archaeological evidence reveals it was built around a truly industrial hydraulic system. The monks diverted a river to create a network of channels that fed multiple water wheels housed in a massive mill building. This complex did not just grind flour for the monastery's bread. It powered an entire integrated workshop, a medieval factory humming with automated activity. This precocious understanding of mechanical advantage transformed the monastery into a center of production. By harnessing water power so effectively, they dramatically increased their output of essential goods, from cloth and leather to forged iron and flour. This surplus not only supported their self-sufficient communities but also became a vital part of the local economy. More importantly, this systematic application of inanimate power laid the foundational principles for a much later revolution. The monastic water mill, with its gears, shafts, and automated hammers, was a direct mechanical ancestor of the machines that would one day drive the Industrial Revolution. It proved that the forces of nature could be channeled to do the work of many hands, an idea that would eventually reshape the entire world. While the water wheels turned, another kind of work was underway in a room kept deliberately quiet and warm. This was the Scriptorium, the monastery's intellectual engine room, where the soft scratch of a quill was the sound of civilization being saved. Here, in a space dedicated to copying texts, monks performed a quiet miracle, preserving the knowledge of the ancient world through centuries of upheaval. Their work was not a simple clerical task, it was an act of profound devotion and immense physical labor. The process began not with ink but with animal skins. A single Bible required the hides of more than 200 sheep, each piece of parchment meticulously scraped, cleaned, and stretched to create a perfect, durable writing surface. The inks themselves were alchemical wonders, painstakingly mixed from soot, minerals, and even crushed insects to produce deep blacks, vibrant reds, and a brilliant blue made from the precious stone lapis lazuli. The result was the illuminated manuscript, a work of art where text and image merged. These were not merely books, they were luminous objects with golden leaves and intricate borders that seemed to capture divine light on the page. But the true heart of this work was the scribe himself, and sometimes his personal voice breaks through the solemnity. In the margins of these sacred texts, we find secret messages from the past. One monk, his hand perhaps cramping from the cold, wrote, "It is bitter cold and the ink is frozen." Another, nearing the end of a long project, simply added, "Thank God it will soon be dark." These tiny human notes remind us that this vast project of preservation was carried out by individuals, each with their own struggles and fleeting moments of weariness. Yet their commitment never truly wavered. Their role, however, extended far beyond copying the old. Monasteries were also vibrant centers of original scholarship. Monks like the Venerable Bede in England compiled massive encyclopedias of world knowledge, blending history, science, and theology. Others wrote detailed chronicles of their own times, creating the historical records we rely on today. They produced scientific treatises on medicine, astronomy, and the natural world, constantly questioning and seeking to understand God's creation. This relentless, cumulative effort, generation after generation, ensured that the flame of classical learning was never extinguished. They became the indispensable bridge, the quiet custodians who carried the intellectual treasures of Rome and Greece across the long centuries, holding them safe until a new era was ready to receive them once more. A weary traveler arriving at the monastery gates with a fever would not be turned away. He would be brought into a space that was, for its time, a sanctuary of healing, the monastic infirmary. Here, the care of the sick was not a sideline duty but a central tenet of their faith, a sacred act of charity. This spiritual calling to care for the ill and the poor led directly to the creation of Europe's first true hospital systems. The monastic infirmary was a place where prayer and practical medicine were intertwined, creating a surprisingly holistic approach to health. The rule of Saint Benedict itself instructed that care for the sick must be placed above and before all else so that they may truly be served as Christ. This was a revolutionary principle in a world where organized healthcare had largely vanished. Within the infirmary, detailed rules governed everything from the patient's diet and bedding to the cleanliness of the air. The monks and nuns who served as caregivers understood the importance of a calm, orderly environment for recovery. Just outside the infirmary walls lay another key component of their medical practice, the herbal garden. These were not simple vegetable patches but meticulously curated collections of hundreds of plants, each with a known medicinal purpose. They cultivated sage for sore throats, lavender for calming nerves, and chamomile for digestive troubles. They studied the effects of these herbs, recording their findings in practical manuals that blended folk knowledge with classical learning. This dedication to medical knowledge extended far beyond their own gardens. Monastic scribes played a crucial role in preserving and expanding Europe's medical library. In quiet scriptoria across the continent, they carefully copied and translated ancient medical texts from Greek and Arabic, works that contained advanced anatomical and pharmaceutical knowledge lost to the Latin West. Figures like Constantine the African, who worked at the monastery of Monte Cassino in the 11th century, dedicated their lives to translating these vital works, bringing Arab medical advancements into European monasteries. This slow, steady accumulation of translated texts, combined with their own practical observations, created a body of medical knowledge that was far more sophisticated than is often credited to the era. Their approach created an enduring template for charitable healthcare. The monastic infirmary, with its focus on hospitality, systematic care, and the study of remedies, became the direct predecessor of the modern hospital. It established a legacy that viewed healing not merely as the application of a remedy, but as an act of compassion that tended to the whole person, body, and soul. That quiet room where scribes copied texts also echoed with the murmurs of students. The monastic school began as a simple necessity, a place to teach new monks to read the sacred texts and sing the divine office. Yet this humble, internal training ground would ignite a revolution in learning that would ripple out to shape the entire Western world. The intellectual energy cultivated behind the abbey walls could not be contained. As monastic communities grew in influence and wealth, they began to establish external schools, opening their doors to the sons of nobles and even promising local boys who were not destined for the religious life. This was a pivotal shift, transforming education from a private, spiritual exercise into a public good. The curriculum these students encountered was not a random collection of subjects, but a meticulously structured path to knowledge known as the liberal arts. It was divided into two clear stages. The first was the trivium, the threefold path of grammar, rhetoric, and logic. This was the foundation of all learning. Grammar taught the mastery of language itself. Rhetoric trained the student to speak and write with persuasive clarity. Logic, or dialectic, provided the tools for reasoned argument and discerning truth from falsehood. Once this foundation was solid, the student progressed to the quadrivium, the fourfold path of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These were not just practical skills, they were seen as the essential disciplines for understanding the order and harmony of God's creation. This entire system was championed by intellectual giants like Alcuin of York, who was invited by Charlemagne to revitalize education across his empire. Alcuin saw learning as a sacred duty, writing that the noble philosophy of the liberal arts illuminates the path to divine wisdom. He and other monastic reformers standardized this curriculum, creating a universal framework for advanced education that could be replicated from one center of learning to another. These monastic schools, with their structured curricula and dedicated masters, became the direct precursors to the first universities. In places like Bologna and Paris, these independent studia generalia emerged, gathering masters and students from all over Europe. And who were the first professors at these new universities? Very often, they were monks and clerics trained in the monastic tradition. The university itself adopted the monastic model of a structured community living under a common rule, dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge. The very idea of a degree, a license to teach, evolved from the certification a monastic school would grant. By systemizing knowledge and creating a stable environment for scholarly debate, the monasteries provided the essential blueprint. They democratized advanced learning, creating a ladder of education that, for the first time in centuries, allowed a talented individual to rise through the power of his intellect, laying the foundation for the modern intellectual world. The quiet hum of the monastic watermill was also the sound of an economy at work. While the monks renounced personal wealth, their communities became some of the most powerful and sophisticated economic engines of the medieval world. They managed sprawling estates, coordinated complex trade networks, and developed financial tools that would one day underpin global commerce. This was not a contradiction of their faith, but a direct result of it. Their vow of stability meant they were tied to a single place for generations, creating an institution with a planning horizon far beyond that of any king or merchant. This long-term perspective, combined with their relentless drive for self-sufficiency, forced them to become masters of capital. Their first great economic innovation was in the management of land. A single monastery might own dozens of granges or farm estates scattered across a region. Managing the flow of grain, livestock, and other goods from these outlying properties to the central abbey required a logistical system of remarkable complexity. They had to coordinate harvests, manage storage in large barns, and organize transport, often using their own rivers and canals. This was a medieval supply chain, operating with a precision that would be impressive even today. Their most famous product was wool. Monasteries, particularly the Cistercians in England, became the wool producers of Europe. They maintained enormous flocks of sheep, bred for the finest fleece, and their abbots negotiated directly with Italian merchant bankers for its sale. The contracts were vast, involving promises of wool to be delivered years in advance. To finance their own building projects and expansion while waiting for these future payments, they began to use letters of credit. A monastery in Yorkshire could receive an advance payment from a banker in Florence, with a letter that could be presented to another monastery or merchant in a different city to obtain funds or materials. This practice reduced the need to transport bulky coin and helped create a safer, more fluid financial network across Europe. The monasteries themselves often acted as de facto banks for their local communities. Peasants would deposit their small savings for safekeeping within the strong monastery walls. The monks, with their meticulous ledgers, kept track of these deposits. They also provided loans not for profit in the modern sense, but as a form of charitable assistance or to help local farmers improve their land. This activity helped stabilize local economies and provided a crucial source of liquidity. Their very stability made them a safe place for the storage of treasure and important documents, a practice that established the foundational concept of a trusted financial institution. Economic historians point to this monastic system as a crucial precursor to modern capitalism. The accumulation of surplus wealth, its careful reinvestment into land improvement and technology like water mills, and the development of sophisticated credit instruments all emerged from the monastery's unique combination of spiritual purpose and practical necessity. They demonstrated that long-term planning, systematic record-keeping, and the pooling of resources could generate immense economic power. This monastic model of enterprise, devoted not to personal gain but to the sustenance and growth of a perpetual community, quietly laid the administrative and financial groundwork for the commercial revolution that would eventually transform the Western world. The meticulous records of grain yields and financial contracts find a surprising parallel in the quiet cool of the monastery cellar. Here, in the dim light, another form of alchemy was taking place, one that turned water and grain into a stable, nutritious beverage and the juice of grapes into a sacred, enduring wine. The monk's work in the brewery or the vineyard was a ritual of patience and precision, a daily practice that quietly advanced the science of fermentation. For communities that observed periods of fasting, beer was more than a drink. It was liquid bread, a vital source of calories and nutrients. This necessity drove them to perfect the art of brewing with a scientist's eye. They carefully selected and malted their barley, controlled the temperature of the mash, and most importantly, they mastered the use of hops. While hops had been known for centuries, it was monastic brewers, particularly in Central Europe, who systematically documented and championed their use. They understood that hops did more than add bitterness. They acted as a natural preservative, allowing beer to be stored for longer periods and transported over distances. This was a breakthrough in quality control. They also pioneered the process of lagering, storing their beer in cold caves for months. This slow, cold aging allowed unwanted sediments to settle out, resulting in a clearer, smoother, and more stable product. Their understanding of sanitation was profound, even if the reason was a mystery to them. They noticed that meticulously cleaned vessels and equipment produced a more reliable and better-tasting beer. They unknowingly practiced a form of sterilization, preventing wild yeasts and bacteria from spoiling the brew long before anyone understood the existence of microorganisms. The same scientific rigor was applied to viticulture. Monks became Europe's most skilled vintners, carefully matching grape varieties to specific soils and microclimates. They kept detailed records of vintages, noting how different weather patterns affected the character of the wine. In regions like Burgundy and Champagne, their walled vineyards, known as clos, became legendary for the quality of their output. They refined techniques of pruning and canopy management to maximize the sun's influence on the grapes, and they perfected the art of aging wine in oak barrels, understanding how the wood could soften and complexify the flavor. These were not haphazard experiments. They were systematic observations that formed an early body of biochemical knowledge. The economic impact of this mastery was immense. The sale of beer and wine, especially from famous monastic producers like the Trappist abbeys, provided a steady and substantial income. This revenue funded the construction of new buildings, supported the care of the poor, and financed the very scholarly and technological pursuits we have already explored. More than just a source of funds, however, these monastic products became deeply woven into the fabric of daily life and celebration across the continent. The quiet work of the monk in the cellar, tending his barrels with a patient hand, did more than create a beverage. It sustained an institution and helped cultivate a culture of quality that echoes in every glass of wine and crafted beer we enjoy today. That same disciplined rhythm that governed the clock and the calendar also gave order to sound itself. Within the chapel, the unison chant of the monks was a powerful, living tradition, passed from one generation to the next by ear alone. But this oral chain was fragile, vulnerable to the subtle shifts and forgetfulness that come with time. A melody in one monastery might slowly drift from its original form in another, a beautiful but unstable inheritance. The solution to this problem was as revolutionary as the written word was for language: the invention of a way to capture sound on the page. The first attempts were simple marks known as neumes, scribbled above the sacred texts. These tiny symbols, looking almost like accents, gave a general hint, a nudge upward or downward for the voice, but they were a memory aid, not a precise map. They could not tell a stranger the exact notes to sing. This crucial leap was made by an 11th century monk named Guido of Arezzo. He saw the limitations of the existing system and devised a brilliant solution: a series of horizontal lines that created a measured space for pitch. This was the staff. With these lines, a neume placed on a specific line or space now had an absolute meaning, representing a specific musical note. To teach this new system, he even used a familiar hymn to Saint John the Baptist, where each succeeding line began on a higher note, giving us the syllables ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la. This was the birth of solfege, a teaching tool that is still used in music classrooms around the world today. The impact of this innovation cannot be overstated. For the first time, a complex melody could be accurately written down in one place and faithfully reproduced by a singer who had never heard it in another place, even centuries later. Music was no longer a fleeting event. It had become a permanent form of knowledge, as stable and transmittable as a philosophical text. This stability allowed for the next great musical revolution, polyphony. Composers could now write not just one melody, but multiple, interdependent lines meant to be sung together. They could experiment with harmony and counterpoint, knowing that their intricate designs could be precisely communicated and performed by large choirs. A standardized musical repertoire spread across Europe, from the great cathedrals to local parish churches, creating a shared sonic culture. The quiet work of a monk, devising lines on parchment to preserve a chant, had given the world a universal language for sound. Every orchestra that rehearses from a score, every band that works from a chord chart, every composer who writes down a new idea, is participating in a tradition that found its first clear voice within the echoing stone walls of a monastery. Far from the bustling trade routes, in silent valleys and dense forests, a new kind of monastery rose from the wilderness. These were the white monasteries of the Cistercian order, their stark, unadorned stone a visible rejection of worldly wealth. Yet within this radical austerity, they built something remarkable, not just a spiritual refuge, but a highly integrated industrial complex. The Cistercians became the supreme example of monastic innovation, a case study in how spiritual devotion could be channeled into a transformative economic and technological force. Their guiding document, the Carta Caritatis, or Charter of Charity, was a masterpiece of organizational design. It created a network of monasteries all following the same rule, with a system of annual meetings where abbots would gather to ensure unity and accountability. This was a centralized administration for a spiritual empire, allowing for the rapid sharing of knowledge and techniques from one end of Europe to the other. To maintain their isolation and support their immense physical labors, they developed a unique two-tiered community. Alongside the choir monks who dedicated their time to prayer and scholarship were the lay brothers known as conversi. These men were not literate clerics but devout laborers who took vows and lived as part of the community, performing the vast majority of the manual work. This division of labor was genius. It freed the choir monks to manage the order's complex affairs, while the lay brothers became the engine of its economic power. Their work extended far beyond the abbey walls through a network of granges, outlying farms that were often a day's journey away. These were not simple barns, they were highly efficient agricultural hubs, staffed by teams of lay brothers who specialized in sheep farming, crop cultivation, or viticulture. But their ambition did not stop at the farm. The Cistercians sought out land rich in another resource, ore. They became pioneers of medieval metallurgy, establishing ironworks powered by the same water mills that ground their grain. They located their forges near sources of charcoal and water power, creating an early industrial supply chain. At sites like Fontenay Abbey in France, the archaeological remains reveal a sophisticated iron production facility, with channels diverting water to drive massive hammers that processed the metal. This iron was not just for their own tools, it became a valuable commodity for trade. The Cistercian system, with its centralized governance, specialized labor force, and diversified production, functioned with the efficiency and reach of a modern multinational corporation. Their spiritual quest for self-sufficiency had, almost paradoxically, made them one of the wealthiest and most powerful economic entities of the 12th century. They demonstrated that the most profound innovations are not always single inventions, but entire systems of organization, proving that a community devoted to prayer could also master the art of enterprise on a breathtaking scale. The silence of the cloister was not an empty void but a fertile ground for the mind. Within those secluded walls, a profound paradox unfolded, where deliberate isolation from the bustling medieval world became the very catalyst for its most enduring innovations. This withdrawal was not a retreat from progress, but a strategic step back to create the conditions for a different kind of advancement. Freed from the constant demands of feudal life, the endless cycles of local conflict, and the immediate pressures of subsistence farming, the monastic mind gained something priceless: uninterrupted mental space. This culture of contemplation, of lectio divina, encouraged deep, sustained thought on a single text or a single technical problem for months or even years. A monk tasked with improving a watermill's gear design was not racing against a harvest deadline or a lord's tax. He was engaged in a long conversation with the machine itself, observing its failures and incremental successes across seasons. This long-term perspective, stretching across generations, is almost unimaginable in our fast-paced world. A project to drain a marsh for new farmland was not judged by a quarterly return, but by whether it would benefit the community a century later. This generational patience allowed for the kind of slow, cumulative improvements that genuine breakthroughs require. Historians of creativity often note that true innovation rarely springs from a moment of frantic activity, but from a state of deep focus where the mind can make unexpected connections. The monastery, by design, provided this environment of enforced focus. It was a sanctuary for the long game, where the solution to a problem in manuscript preservation could be patiently sought for a lifetime, and the results carefully recorded for the next brother to continue the work. The greatest projects of the age, from the architectural plans of a cathedral that would take 300 years to complete, to the meticulous breeding of a new strain of wheat, were all born from this unique blend of isolation and immense stability. It proves a timeless truth that to make a profound leap forward, it is sometimes necessary to first create a quiet space to stand. But the scriptorium was far more than a quiet library. It was a linguistic laboratory in constant motion. While the primary task was indeed the faithful reproduction of sacred texts, the monks who bent over their parchment were not human photocopiers. They were editors, grammarians, and scholars engaged in a profound act of cultural preservation that demanded constant intellectual judgment. Their first monumental achievement was the rescue and standardization of the Latin language itself. After the fall of Rome, Latin had begun to fracture into regional dialects, threatening to make the vast corpus of classical and Christian literature incomprehensible to future generations. In response, monastic scribes, particularly under the influence of scholars like Alcuin during the Carolingian Renaissance, undertook a massive project of linguistic reform. They developed a new, clear, and uniform script known as Carolingian minuscule. This was a revolution in readability. Unlike the cramped, irregular scripts that came before it, Carolingian minuscule featured distinct lowercase letters, consistent spacing between words, and the humble yet transformative introduction of punctuation. For the first time, a reader could move through a text smoothly, pausing at commas and stopping at periods, guided by the visual cues on the page. This seemingly simple innovation made silent reading a practical possibility, fundamentally changing humanity's relationship with the written word. But their work did not stop with perfecting Latin. In the margins of these orderly texts, a more chaotic and equally vital project was underway. As monks copied classical works or recorded local histories, they often added glosses, small translations or explanations written in their own vernacular tongues. A Latin word might have its Old English or Old High German equivalent scribbled above it. These casual notes, never intended for posterity, are now priceless treasures for linguists. They prove that the monastery, while a bastion of universal Latin, was also a cradle for emerging European languages, accidentally preserving the very dialects it was standardizing against. The process of copying was itself an act of critical scholarship. A monk would often work from multiple, imperfect source manuscripts. When he encountered conflicting passages or obvious errors, he had to become a textual detective, comparing versions and making informed decisions about the correct reading. He would sometimes leave a note in the margin, signaling his uncertainty or explaining his choice. This critical engagement turned each new copy into a refined edition, slowly weeding out centuries of accumulated mistakes and ensuring that the knowledge passed forward was as accurate as humanly possible. This relentless collective work on the very tools of communication, on grammar, spelling, and critical editing, created a stable platform for all future thought. Without this centuries-long project of linguistic housekeeping, the rediscovery of classical texts during the Renaissance would have been impossible, their meaning lost in a fog of corrupted copies and impenetrable script. The quiet scratching of pens in 1,000 Scriptoria did not just save old books, it safeguarded the very medium through which new ideas, from scientific theories to political manifestos, would one day be born and spread across the world. Beyond the infirmary walls lay a living library of remedies, a garden meticulously divided into quadrants of green. The monastic garden was a place of profound order and purpose, where every plant, from the humblest cabbage to the most fragrant lavender, held a specific role in the community's physical and spiritual well-being. These were not just plots for food, they were sophisticated laboratories of botany and pharmacy under the open sky. The layout itself was a map of their knowledge. A typical garden was organized into 3 distinct sections. The first was the kitchen garden, providing the staples of the monastic diet: onions, leeks, beans, and cabbages, ensuring a steady supply of nutritious vegetables. The second was the medicinal garden, the true heart of their scientific endeavor. Here they cultivated a vast array of herbs, each chosen for its known or suspected healing properties. They grew sage for sore throats, mint for digestion, and valerian to calm the nerves. The third section was often a flower garden, but even this had a dual purpose. Flowers like roses and lilies adorned the altar, while others, such as calendula, were harvested for their antiseptic qualities, used in salves for wounds and skin ailments. The work here was systematic and observant. Monks did not simply grow plants, they experimented with them. They practiced early forms of crossbreeding, selecting seeds from the healthiest specimens to improve the yield or potency of the next generation. They carefully documented the conditions each plant thrived in, noting the amount of sun, the type of soil, and the timing of the harvest. This empirical study transformed the garden into a constantly evolving database of botanical knowledge. The fruits of this labor were compiled into beautifully illustrated books known as herbals. These were the pharmacopoeias of the medieval world, detailed manuals that described each plant, its appearance, its preferred habitat, and its medicinal uses. A monk consulting an herbal would learn how to prepare a poultice from comfrey to mend a broken bone, or a tea from chamomile to ease a troubled stomach. These books were not static, they were updated as new plants were discovered and new applications were tested within the infirmary. This carefully gathered knowledge did not remain locked behind the monastery walls. As monks traveled to found new communities or as pilgrims visited the abbeys, seeds, cuttings, and this invaluable horticultural wisdom spread across the continent. The monastery garden became a node in a vast, informal network of botanical exchange, introducing new food crops and effective herbal remedies to villages and towns. The quiet, methodical work of these monastic gardeners enriched the European diet, expanded its medical toolkit, and laid the practical foundations for the science of botany itself, all cultivated within the peaceful order of a walled garden. A single monastery, no matter how brilliant, was an island. But what happens when you connect islands with a web of purpose? The monastic world was not a collection of isolated outposts, but a vast, living network, a nervous system for knowledge that spanned the continent. This system operated on two distinct but powerful levels. The first was the formal, administrative network. Orders like the Cistercians were governed by a brilliant organizational structure. Each year, abbots from across Europe would travel to a central location for a general chapter, a massive meeting of minds. Here, they did more than discuss spiritual matters, they shared blueprints. An abbot from Yorkshire might describe a new, more efficient design for a watermill his monks had developed. An abbot from Burgundy would explain a revolutionary technique for grafting fruit trees that had doubled their yield. These were not secrets to be hoarded, but discoveries to be shared for the common good of the entire order. This system of structured visitation was equally crucial. Senior abbots would regularly travel to inspect daughter houses, ensuring they adhered to the rule, but also acting as conduits for innovation. They carried with them the collective intelligence of the order, a living database of best practices in agriculture, architecture, and engineering. Alongside this official network thrived an informal, human one. Monks were not permanently fixed to one stone. They traveled constantly, moving to found new communities, to study at a different abbey with a famous teacher, or simply as pilgrims. Each traveling monk was a courier of ideas. He carried in his memory the melody of a new chant, the formula for a stronger mortar, or the knowledge of how to treat a specific illness with a rare herb found only in his home region. This constant, quiet migration of knowledgeable individuals meant that a breakthrough in a remote French valley could appear in an English fenland within a few years. Think of a new type of plow that worked better in heavy soil. The design did not need to be independently rediscovered in 100 different places. Through the network, its specifications were copied and were adapted locally, accelerating progress for everyone. This collaborative engine, both formal and informal, functioned with a speed and efficiency that was unprecedented for its time. It was a kind of medieval internet where the packets of data were human minds and carefully copied manuscripts, and the servers were the great abbey libraries. This powerful network effect ensured that knowledge once created did not stagnate. It flowed, it improved, and it ultimately escaped the cloister to reshape the world beyond its walls. Yet the very wealth and success born from this innovation made the monasteries a target. The tranquility of the cloister was a fragile thing, repeatedly shattered by the thunder of raids and the weight of political ambition. Far from halting progress, these relentless pressures forged it in fire. The threat of Viking longships appearing on the river forced communities to think like military engineers, strengthening their walls and designing fortified gatehouses that were both defensive strongpoints and architectural marvels. When kings or local lords demanded exorbitant taxes or seized their lands, the monastic response was not surrender, but a drive for greater efficiency. They had to squeeze more grain from their fields, more power from their watermills, and more profit from their wool trade just to survive. This was innovation born of sheer necessity. Perhaps the most profound, if tragic, example of this dispersal was the dissolution of monasteries under rulers like Henry VIII. When the great abbeys were emptied and their lands sold off, their vast estates, advanced mills, and systematic farming practices did not vanish. Instead, they were broken up and passed into secular hands. The local gentry and rising merchant classes who acquired these properties inherited a ready-made industrial and agricultural infrastructure. They took over the Cistercian sheep runs, the efficient iron forges, and the sophisticated drainage systems. This forced secularization, while ending the monastic way of life, acted as the ultimate technology transfer. Knowledge and techniques that had been refined behind walls for centuries were suddenly unleashed into the wider economy, accelerating progress across the board. The ability to adapt, to turn crisis into opportunity, was woven into the very fabric of their endurance. Their greatest invention, perhaps, was resilience itself, a stubborn capacity to rebuild, rethink, and reinvent in the face of every storm, ensuring that the seeds of progress they cultivated would take root in the world outside. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil was a sacred sound in its own right, a percussive hymn of transformation. Within the monastic forge, fire and water were tamed to master the most stubborn of materials, metal. This was not a simple blacksmith shop, but a sophisticated center of metallurgy where spiritual discipline met the demands of the physical world. The key to their success was once again their mastery of water. They channeled streams to drive massive water wheels, which in turn powered two revolutionary tools. The first was the water-powered trip hammer, a mechanical giant that lifted a heavy hammer head and let it drop with relentless, tireless force. This machine could crush ore, forge large iron blooms, and shape metal with a power far beyond the reach of a man's arm. The second was water-powered bellows, which maintained a constant, powerful blast of air into their furnaces. This steady draft created the intense heat necessary for efficient smelting, turning raw ore into workable iron on an unprecedented scale. The Cistercians, with their affinity for remote, mineral-rich valleys, became the iron masters of Europe. They located their abbeys near deposits of ore and forests for charcoal, creating self-contained industrial hubs. At places like the Abbey of Fontenay, the entire production line was powered by hydraulics, from ore crushing to the final forging. Their output was staggering, serving a dual purpose. On one hand, they produced the robust tools that fueled their own agricultural revolution, heavy plowshares that could turn dense soil, durable axes for clearing forests, and strong nails for their ever-expanding building projects. On the other, their forges created objects of breathtaking artistry. Skilled monastic metalworkers poured the same devotion into crafting intricate liturgical objects, delicate chalices, ornate censers, and elaborate book covers adorned with filigree and precious metals. These pieces were not merely decorative, they were tangible expressions of faith, designed to elevate the liturgy into a multisensory experience. This mastery over metal created a vital economic engine. The surplus tools and raw iron produced in the monastic forges flowed out to the surrounding manors and towns, supplying local blacksmiths and farmers with higher quality materials than they could typically produce themselves. The monks did not just make tools, they advanced the very techniques of European metalworking, perfecting processes that would underpin everything from improved armor and weaponry to the machinery of the coming age. The legacy of the monastic forge is written in iron and fire, a testament to how the pursuit of self-sufficiency could ignite an industrial flame that would warm and shape an entire continent. A community of hundreds spread across dozens of farms and workshops cannot be managed by prayer alone. Beneath the soaring arches and behind the quiet cloisters, the monks were perfecting an invention of a different kind, one made not of stone or metal, but of rules and records. This was the birth of a sophisticated administrative machine, an intellectual framework for governance that would become one of their most influential and unseen exports. At the heart of this system were the charters and cartularies. Whenever a king or a noble donated a parcel of land to the monastery, the transaction was recorded in a formal charter. These were not simple receipts, they were legally binding documents that detailed the exact boundaries, the rights to resources like timber and water, and the obligations of all parties. To protect these precious titles from loss or damage, monks compiled them into bound volumes called cartularies. Think of a cartulary as a medieval corporate ledger, a single, authoritative source of truth for the entire institution's assets. This created a powerful form of institutional memory, allowing an abbot to prove his community's rights against a challenging local lord by simply opening a book written 50 years before. This culture of documentation extended to daily management. Monastic cellars and bursars kept painstakingly detailed financial accounts, recording every bushel of grain received from a distant grange, every penny earned from the wool trade, and every expense for building repairs. They developed early forms of double-entry bookkeeping to track complex transactions, ensuring that the community's vast economic activities were transparent and accountable. This meticulous record-keeping transformed the monastery from a simple religious house into a perpetual legal entity, a corporation that could outlive any of its individual members. It could own property, sue in court, and enter into contracts all in its own name. This concept of a corporation, an institution that exists separately from the people who run it, was a monumental legal innovation. To manage their sprawling estates, they conducted systematic land surveys, creating detailed maps and registers that catalogued not only fields and forests, but also the tenants living on them and the rents they owed. This bureaucratic machinery, with its emphasis on written evidence and standardized procedures, provided a ready-made model for the rising secular states. When kings began to consolidate their power and build their own royal administrations, they often turned to the best managers available, educated clerics who had trained in the monastic tradition. These men brought the habits of careful accounting, charter writing, and archival organization into royal service. The Domesday Book, the Great Survey of England commissioned by William the Conqueror, stands as a monumental example of this borrowed administrative technology. The quiet work of a monk updating a land register in his scriptorium was, in its own way, as revolutionary as the turning of a water wheel. It proved that the most durable structures are not always made of stone, but of information, order, and a system designed to endure long after its creators are gone. A world drawn on parchment was both a spiritual vision and a practical guide. Within the scriptorium, alongside the sacred texts, monks meticulously crafted maps known as Mappae Mundi. These were not the precise navigational charts we know today, but something far more profound, intricate diagrams of the entire Christian cosmos. Jerusalem often sat at the very center of the world, with the Garden of Eden placed somewhere in the distant east. Strange creatures might inhabit the edges, marking the unknown territories beyond the reach of salvation. This was geography in the service of theology, a visual sermon meant to illustrate humanity's place in a divine plan. Yet to dismiss these maps as mere fantasy is to miss their deeper purpose. They organized a vast and chaotic world into a coherent, meaningful story, providing a mental framework that shaped the European imagination for centuries. Alongside these symbolic masterpieces, however, a more practical cartography was also taking shape. For the pilgrim setting out for Rome or Santiago de Compostela, a monastery might provide a simple itinerary, a list of towns and distances along a well-traveled route. These were the road maps of their day, born from the collected reports of countless travelers who had passed through the abbey gates. The monks also engaged with the most advanced nautical science of the era, carefully copying portolan charts. These mariners' maps, filled with detailed coastlines and compass roses, were vital tools for Mediterranean trade. By preserving them, the monasteries ensured that this hard-won practical knowledge was not lost. The role of the monk cartographer was that of a synthesizer, a central clearinghouse for the world's whispers. Pilgrims shared tales of the roads they had walked, merchants described the strange goods and coasts they had seen, and missionaries sent back detailed letters from the farthest corners of the known world. A Franciscan monk named William of Rubruck, for instance, undertook a grueling journey to the court of the Mongol Khan in the 13th century. His written account provided Europeans with one of the most accurate and vivid descriptions of Central Asia they had ever received. It was from 1,000 such fragments of information, gathered over generations, that the monastic geographers slowly pieced together a clearer picture of the globe. Their work was a continuous, collaborative project of correction and refinement, a slow turning of the theological map into something that could, eventually, guide a ship across an ocean. Every advance, from the watermill to the musical staff, was guided by a single, powerful principle. Innovation was not a path to personal fame or wealth, but a form of service, a practical expression of charity for the community, and a reflection of divine order. This ethical core transformed their entire approach to progress. The vow of stability was crucial here, rooting the monk to one place for life. This was not a limitation, but a liberation from short-term thinking. It fostered a profound sense of stewardship, a responsibility to care for the land, the buildings, and the knowledge entrusted to them, not for a season, but for generations to come. A new milling technique or a better crop rotation was not a proprietary secret to be sold to the highest bidder. It was a shared resource, a gift to be passed along the network of abbeys for the benefit of all. Their work was designed to alleviate the burden of labor, to free the human spirit for prayer and study, not to create new forms of dependency. This stands in quiet contrast to much of our modern narrative of innovation, which is so often driven by competition and the promise of individual reward. The monastic model presents a compelling alternative, a vision of progress measured not by market share, but by communal well-being, where the ultimate purpose of a new technology is to serve, to heal, and to sustain. This was an engine of progress powered not by greed, but by grace, offering a timeless question about what we choose to build, and more importantly, who we choose to build it for. That same administrative machinery, so vital for managing vast estates, could not protect the monasteries from a shifting world. The very success that made them powerful also attracted the envy of kings and the criticism of reformers. From the late Middle Ages onward, a great unraveling began as rulers across Europe moved to suppress these independent centers of wealth and influence. The most famous of these acts was the dissolution of the monasteries in England under King Henry VIII. A systematic dismantling that saw hundreds of religious houses closed in just a few short years. Their lands were seized, their treasures confiscated, and their communities dispersed. To an observer at the time, it must have looked like the end of a 1,000-year legacy. But history had a different outcome in mind. This suppression, while ending a way of life, became the greatest and most unexpected technology transfer in European history. The closure of a monastery did not destroy its innovations, it released them. The meticulously managed granges, the advanced water-powered forges, the carefully bred livestock, and the vast libraries did not vanish into the air. They were sold off, piece by piece, to the rising gentry, wealthy merchants, and commercial farmers. A local landowner who purchased a former Cistercian sheep run did not just acquire a field, he inherited generations of accumulated knowledge about animal husbandry and pasture management. A merchant consortium that took over a monastic ironworks acquired a fully operational industrial facility, complete with the hydraulic engineering expertise to keep it running. This was knowledge by acquisition. The new secular owners had every incentive to maintain and even expand these profitable enterprises, applying the monastic methods for their own commercial gain. The techniques for crop rotation, soil enrichment, and systematic viticulture, once confined to the abbey's estates, now became standard practice on privately owned lands, boosting agricultural productivity across the continent. The scholarly traditions faced a similar transformative journey. When monastic libraries were broken up, their books did not burn. They were scattered, finding new homes in the private collections of nobles, the nascent libraries of universities, and the studies of early humanist scholars. The painstakingly preserved works of Aristotle, Galen, and Archimedes, once read in a cloister, were now pored over by civic-minded intellectuals in Florence and Padua. The monastic habit of meticulous record-keeping and systematic inquiry provided a ready-made model for the first scientists, who simply turned the same rigorous gaze from scripture to nature itself. This was not a violent end, but a quiet metamorphosis. The engine of progress, built and maintained for centuries behind stone walls, was now disassembled and its parts distributed to the world. The suppression of the monasteries forced their accumulated genius into the open, democratizing knowledge and technique on a mass scale. It was a tragic irony that the dissolution of these communities provided the very fuel for the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, proving that an idea, once set in motion, is far more durable than the institution that first gave it shelter. The term Dark Ages itself is a profound misnomer, a shadow cast backward by a later era eager to proclaim its own brilliance. This popular image of a millennium shrouded in ignorance and stagnation simply cannot hold against the evidence we have explored. While great urban centers of the classical world faced hardship, the light of progress was not extinguished. It was merely gathered and concentrated, burning with a steady, patient flame within the Scriptoria, forges, and fields of monastic communities. Think of the mechanical clock, a device born from the need to regiment prayer that went on to restructure all of human consciousness around measurable time. Consider the Gothic arch and the flying buttress, solutions to an architectural problem of light and height that yielded some of the most sublime structures ever built by human hands. Recall the systematic crop rotations and the industrial application of water power that transformed entire landscapes and economies. This was not an age of poverty, but one of quiet, cumulative, and deeply purposeful advancement. The so-called darkness was, in reality, a necessary incubation period. The relentless, collaborative work of generations of monks provided the stable foundation upon which the later explosions of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution could securely stand. They were not opposing forces, but consecutive chapters in the same long story of human ingenuity. By letting go of the myth of a dark and stagnant past, we do more than correct a historical error. We gain a deeper appreciation for the many forms innovation can take, not always loud and disruptive, but often silent, steady, and devoted to a purpose greater than itself. The rhythmic, focused environment of a medieval monastery has a direct descendant in the modern open-source software community. A developer contributing code to a massive project like the Linux operating system is engaged in a surprisingly similar act of devotion as a monk annotating a manuscript. Both work without immediate personal reward, driven by a shared belief in a common good. Their labor is given freely to a collective repository of knowledge, meticulously documented and open for anyone to use, improve, and build upon. This is not a new idea, it is a very old one reborn in digital form. The principle of radical collaboration across a distributed network, a hallmark of monastic orders, is the same engine that powers today's most innovative spaces. Think of a Silicon Valley startup, its team working in a focused, almost cloistered intensity. They are not driven by short-term profits alone, but by a mission to solve a profound problem. This sense of higher purpose, whether it is connecting the world or advancing artificial intelligence, mirrors the spiritual drive that fueled monastic innovation. Both environments understand that true breakthroughs require deep, uninterrupted work, free from the constant distractions of the everyday world. The modern research university is another clear echo of this ancient model. It is a community dedicated to the long-term pursuit of knowledge, where scholars, much like monastic scribes, are evaluated by their contributions to a lasting intellectual tradition. They publish their findings, sharing discoveries openly through papers and conferences, creating a cumulative body of work that benefits all of humanity. This system of peer review and shared scholarship is a direct evolution of the monastic practice of copying, correcting, and commenting on texts across generations. The most successful modern organizations, from tech giants to non-profit research institutes, have internalized these timeless principles. They invest heavily in research and development, understanding that real innovation cannot be rushed. They cultivate cultures of documentation, ensuring that knowledge is not lost when an individual moves on. They create physical and cultural spaces designed to minimize distraction and maximize creative flow. The medieval monks discovered a powerful recipe for human achievement, a blend of deep focus, ethical purpose, and systematic knowledge sharing. Their legacy is not merely a collection of old inventions, but a living blueprint for how we continue to organize ourselves to build the future. Our journey from the watermill to the scriptorium reveals a profound truth, that monasteries were not quiet backwaters, but the vibrant engines that powered medieval Europe into the future. We have seen how a unique blend of spiritual discipline, communal living, and relentless intellectual curiosity produced a staggering array of innovations. These quiet revolutionaries laid the essential groundwork for the modern world, the mechanical clock that regiments our time, the university that shapes our mind, the very concept of a corporation, even the principles of systematic research and open collaboration, all bear the invisible hand of the monk inventor. This hidden history serves as a powerful reminder that progress often wears a humble disguise. It asks us to look more carefully at the quiet places in our own world, to wonder what other engines of change might be quietly at work, hidden in plain sight. If this story of quiet revolution has enlightened your view of the past, we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to continue exploring the fascinating and often overlooked corners of history with us.